Have we got Sam on the line? Oh, yep, your URA Debating Society.
Cool, I see the sign saying we're streaming live, so without further ado, welcome everyone to the debate, the second round of Schools Nationals 2020. I'd like to invite the first speaker to come, of the affirmative team, to come and begin the debate.
We'll just have to move you around just because like our room set up. Yeah. Good. I just move it a bit. Okay. In 1981, we saw sport in New Zealand become so interconnected with our politics and identity that it caused us to question everything we stood for as a nation. The resulting Springbok tour caused us to compromise our values and erupted into massive civil disturbance. We regret that we ever allowed sport to become so important to our national identity that it caused us to lose our moral values and what we stood for as a nation as a whole today. So our path to victory in this debate today is to prove that we win when we prove that the prominence of sports in New Zealand national identity isolates New Zealanders and divides more than it unites. So what we specifically regret in this debate today is like the large culture surrounding like rugby, specifically male rugby, and specifically like the men's All Black team. We think that that causes a lot of harm in this debate today, and we regret that this has taken away focus from things like women's rights and the Indigenous treatment, and we regret like the ensuing whitewashing and the ensuing boys club that has resulted from this culture around the All Blacks. We'll be bringing three main arguments today. Firstly, what is the purpose of a national identity and why does sport not fit this purpose? Secondly, what are the tangible harms caused by having this prominence of sports and national identity? And thirdly, what is the harm that comes from not prioritising other industries and sectors of New Zealand? Okay, I'll now move on to my first substantive. Why does sport not fit the purpose of a national identity? So on this point, I'll discuss what we think the criteria for a national identity is and why sport does not meet this threshold. So we believe that a national identity should unite people. We want people to have a sense of national belonging, and we think the national identity is really important because it promotes things like collective action, and like collective action which encourages New Zealanders to like do things like work together to combat things like coronavirus, like climate change, things like that. And it also is important for our national image on a global scale. We want people to like think the right things about New Zealand. We want people to believe like to think that we're more than just sport, and to think that we're multifaceted. We think that's really important today. Okay, so now that we know what the threshold is to provide like a unitary sense and to provide a like really representative image of New Zealand, what are the reasons that sport does not fit this? A few things here. Firstly, sport involves a lot of like exclusionary factors. This can really reinforce some really like classist divides that already exist in New Zealand society. One of these factors is things like gender, right? So we see like things like the male All Blacks being like focused on way more heavily than like the female rugby team. We think that this exclusionary group also involves things like class, right? So there's like an in-group of rugby players like who are pretty privileged, who can like take Saturdays off work. We think this looks like a bunch of like mainly rural, like 30-year-old white men. We think that this looks like celebrating only one part of New Zealand society, and we think that's a really bad thing. Secondly, we think that it's also quite divisionary, because if we have a national identity, we'd want it to be something that could bring people together. We don't think that rugby does that. We think that the country is like split into like 8 super rugby teams or whatever, and we think that this causes a lot of animosity between different groups. We think that sport does this. Like we saw this like even 2 weeks ago. Like 2 boys from Puniki Rugby Club were like beaten up by 2 boys from Tawa Rugby Club because Tawa won that morning. So I think that this has really heightened a lot of division, and we don't think that this fulfills the purpose of bringing people together. Okay, why does this not fulfill the purpose of our international image? So we want people to see New Zealand as a multifaceted society, which is more than white men playing rugby. We'd much rather they focused on things like our Māori culture. We'd much rather they focused on our wildlife and scenery and how pretty progressive we are with things like women's rights. We think that these are way more important. We want people to have these ideas about New Zealand because we want them to come for like tourism. We want people to want to move here. We want people to want to have diplomatic relations with New Zealand. We would much rather focus on these for our international image. So what do we know at the end of this point? We know that there is a criteria for a national identity, and we know that sport does not meet this criteria. We know that this means that we can't have as much collective action. We don't have as many people like wanting to come to New Zealand for the right reasons. And we have like a divisionary national identity. We're fractured, not united. And that's why that does not fit the purpose. Onto my second substantive, how this exacerbates existing social divides in New Zealand. So I'll be discussing the tangible harms here of having sport as a really prominent part of our national identity. Okay, so we think this is really important because while sport may be like a nice form of like entertainment or a career opportunity for like a few people, we think that ultimately like the lives of New Zealanders and the possible discrimination that people get and the glorification of a very small group of society is way more important than any possible benefits of having like lots of sports as our national identity. There are a few reasons that it exacerbates these social divides. Firstly, it glorifies an already privileged sector. Because sport is such a part of our New Zealand identity, we tend to glorify both sport and the people who play it. The problem with this is a lot of these people look like the sort of people who don't work on a Saturday morning, who can afford to play rugby, who can afford like the really expensive rugby boots, who can afford the physio. They look like white men, and this looks like a culture centered around them and only them. This means that there's like a boys' club, right? I mean, no one even knows when the women's World Rugby Cup is, right? So this creates a boys' club. And this also means that we have so much media attention directed towards this, like men's sport, as opposed to other issues, which are like way more important. So like in the nightly news, maybe 20 minutes of like the hour-long program is dedicated to sport, and probably 15 of those minutes are just talking about the All Blacks, right? We think this glorifies already privileged white men and neglects other issues which we think deserve way more attention in the media and as a culture as a whole. Okay, secondly, another tangible harm is that this actually diverts government resources. Because of our international marketing and this idea that this is our national identity and is our international image, the government actually spends like a lot of money on like funding things like, you know, massive games at Eden Park, the rugby union, international tours. And we think that, sure, like spending money on things for our national image is fine, but not when there's an opportunity cost. Like this massive amount of money, we would much rather was spent on things like drawing attention to the amount of kids who go to school without lunch every day, on like domestic violence victims, right? We think that all this stuff is really important, and we think that this is the opportunity cost of glorifying rugby and other sport to this extent, and we think that these government resources should be going to like way more important places. Thirdly, we think that sport players are actually probably like realistically quite bad role models for young people. We think that a lot of young people look up to like sports stars, people look up to people like Dan Carter or Kieran Reid and people like that. And we think that's actually a negative thing because this contributes to like a real culture in New Zealand that we have of like, oh, she'll be right, you know, like this culture of not wanting to like talk about anything, of wanting to like keep going all the time. And we think that this contributes again to the boys' club that I talked about before. We think that this looks like things like maybe Kieran Reid like getting a concussion and continuing to play, and people seeing that, like young kids seeing that and glorifying that and not wanting to like tell someone when they get hurt. So we think that that really contributes to that negative culture. So what do we know at the end of this point? We know that even if sports are important to New Zealand, which we don't realistically think that they're important enough to make a national identity, we think that we value like healthy values and not glorifying these privileged people at the expense of people who actually need it. And that is why we regret the prominence of sport as New Zealand's national identity. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the first speaker of the negative team, Mia, to come and begin her team's case.
Sport is a significant pillar for New Zealand's identity that bolsters inclusivity, communal collaboration, and national identity. Due to its large stake and prominence within media in New Zealand and in the world stage, its highly televised prominence gives you a sort of sport, an unprecedented level of positive change that you can only achieve through sport. So what do we stand for in our debate today? Three things. We stand for a nation that develops and promotes inclusion opportunities, a national identity which supports communities nationwide, and thirdly, we stand for national pride. We support the status quo. With that in mind, we're bringing you three arguments to the debate today. Firstly, how sport shapes cultural identity. Secondly, the inclusivity and opportunity. And Mel will be bringing you a split at second on the contribution to communities. But first, I'd like to rebut the statements made by First F. So First F gave us a few criteria on what constitutes national identity and how sport fails in each of these. I'd like to address these individually. So let's look at these exclusionary factors. They talked about a classes divide. They said that rugby divides a nation, which we think is inherently wrong. We've seen, particularly in places with the Rugby World Cup, that the entire nation has rallied around the support of the All Blacks and has actually brought communities together to either watch the All Blacks, support this sort of team, and has built a really important national identity through collaboration and supporting a team as significant as the All Blacks are. Even within the international community, we think that specifically they said we're ignoring Māori culture. We think that actually the Māori proportion of people and the start of the haka on an international stage sends a really important message that we're really proud of our Māori culture and heritage, and that we're leading to people as being more resilient and humility. I think that when Side F comes out and said that we're being condemned by the international community because sport is inherently wrong, I actually think on side Neg, we think it's the opposite. We think that people actually view New Zealand as more as a favourite, when Richie McCaw's sort of idea of sweeping the shed has earned the favour of the world for New Zealand being an incredibly humble nation. We think that's a really important message that we send across. And also in the case of Nikki Hamlin in the Olympics, where she athlete, we think that's again a really important message we're sending to the international community, that New Zealand is one and resilience. We don't think we're portraying at all negative identities of sport, and actually through the huge stage and international creation of sport that it's televised, New Zealand creates a really strong message of being a humble, resilient nation that ultimately helps all of its people in its nation and outside. So on that point, this point of opportunity cost, we think that sport provides a really significant area for attention. We see this when the All Blacks are like advertising equity within schools, like providing sports. On that point, Jonathan, we think that this huge portrayal gives really important focus towards issues, and even so, we think that it's not an opportunity cost. We don't think entertainment and human happiness is a cost when we see people generally really enjoying rugby and having huge gains in this. So let's move on to my substantive, how sport shapes cultural identity. So New Zealand's cultural identity sort of encompasses two things, both contemporarily and historically. Now we see New Zealand as of pioneering spirit. There's a really great community spirit of prosperity and resilience within its identity that we've particularly seen manifested through COVID-19 as a nation being open-minded. Secondly, throughout history, we think it's really important to note that cultural identity has centered itself upon this history between Māori and Pākehā, and that the community and Māori identity this is vital to New Zealand's identity. I'll explain why sport provides a constant for generations to become inspired, and why you get better, and why national identity is really, really significant through sport. So how do we get this? We think it's really important because sport reflects integral values of New Zealand's identity of improvement, resilience and grit. And this whole sort of community spirit through its play, we're going to see people rallied behind hard work, you know, sort of with the idea of Eliza McCartney, the entire nation rallied behind the underdog who was able to rise up through hard work. And that's a really important message that it's girls that they can do this. Yes, I'll take a POI.
If we wanted to celebrate like New Zealand values, wouldn't we rather that we celebrated things like Māori values over things like sport?
We don't think that Māori values are exclusive to sport, as I'll explain later, how we actually get more of an inclusion and identity within sport. So moving on. as we get like this highly publicized and sport becomes so idolized, the entire nation is being invoked by the sense of national pride on a huge stage. We get really significant impacts of this. We get a level of national unity that we don't see through anything else except through a tragedy, which is incredibly problematic. We think sport is a really important way to inspire people through this mechanism without and invoke national identity without any significant costs. So why does sport give national identity, and how is it important, and why it manifests itself in this way? So national identity is really important because without any unification, you're going to get split views and inability to connect with others and lack of an obligation to a nation. So when we see this lack of connectivity, we see like damaging communities because you don't feel like you belong. So you don't really have this responsibility, which is something relegates us upon. If I'm a family from a rural community out of touch with sort of like the economic and social epicenter of New Zealand, sport is a really great and important way for me to engage with the nation and feel included within it, and that I'm not going to get through anywhere else. It's a really important way, and often the only way for many rural people to connect and engage with people. And we think this level of engagement is really important to ensure that we secure this, to get a broad and inclusive national identity. Onto my second system, inclusivity and opportunity. Now, people are inherently disadvantaged. Those from low socioeconomic backgrounds or marginalized communities have severely disadvantaged opportunities to massively through New Zealand society. You know, it's really unlikely that people are going to become doctors in 7-figure salaries when they become from really low socioeconomic backgrounds. So particularly within sports, like we see a really, really important sense of elitism through like the whole university aspect where people actually think they can't achieve this. What happens when you get with sports is you provide a more equal platform and greater inclusivity and opportunity for people to do this. Why does this happen? 3 reasons. First of all, we think it's important to use the examples of the All Blacks, which have an unprecedented scale of attention within New Zealand and sends a really important message of comprised of multiple ethnicities and backgrounds. And actually, the gradual greater televisation of rugby, of rugby sevens and women's hockey, sends a really important message to minorities and those from disadvantageous backgrounds to view people from similar backgrounds reaching this level of success. This whole like classism, which side F mentions, actually becomes mitigated under our side of the house because this whole notion and concept of a team preaches an identity of inclusion. And it's really important to mention that most of our successful teams have completely different ethnicities and backgrounds because it's based on ability largely rather than wealth, as seen in the sports such as rugby and netball and hockey. We think it's because of how highly publicized it is, it's incredibly inspirational and achieves an unprecedented level to achieve this inclusivity and option. So what are the impacts? You get people from disadvantageous backgrounds becoming more empowered because they recognize and actually see that they can achieve these significant levels of success. We have more inclusive and broad national identity across people from different communities because they can visualize themselves in this way. And you get people feeling more valued and recognized because they know of the hard work and the equitable and fair national identity that they can contribute to. So at the end of the debate, we think it's really important to have a national identity that is inclusive and that is not at the harm or at the risk of bringing people down along with it. So proud to propose.
Awesome, thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite Sophie, the second speaker of Wellington Gold, to come and continue their team's case.
Unmuted. Oh, my phone, sorry. Oh, okay. It is disappointing to say that New Zealand Māori citizens have to live this life where people know more about rugby league than their own Māori history, and that is the sad reality in New Zealand. This is demoralising for them, and it is an effect of an unrepresentative national identity. This leads to people feeling isolated, they've unappreciated, and what it does overall, it discourages collective action and non-rugby achievements. We want a collective identity so people feel welcomed and appreciated in their own nation and brought up, and we can't even give this to our own Indigenous people. This is what NEG has to defend. Three parts of rebuttal today I'm going to give to you. First, we're going to talk about the opportunity costs that this has. Secondly, we're going to talk about cultural identity, and then finally we're going to talk about community in today's debate. So first, let's talk about the opportunity cost. So the affirmative team told us that under their side, they actually do get an opportunity cost. They said that the All Blacks actually do advertise equity. We actually strongly think that this is very tokenistic. We think that they do support equity, but it's not the big picture. The overall goal of the All Blacks is to make their own profit and to promote sport. They don't really care about equity. But secondly, on that, we think that even if they do, the problem with this is that people actually don't even know what projects these All Blacks actually endorse and support. They don't know the exact actions they're doing. And if you are from the international community, you only see them as the All Blacks and not as a group that is helping minority people who are poor or other industries or artists. So what we would actually rather have on our side is promoting our women's rights campaign, promoting feminism in New Zealand, or promoting our Māori history straight up and directly, because then people from the international community or even from our own community have an exact and direct idea of what's going on, rather than not being able to name a single project that the All Blacks run themselves. We want it to be in the spotlight, not an after effect from the All Blacks. So let's now look into the point of shaping cultural identity that they gave to us. So under this point, they talked to us about improvement, resilience, and grit under their side. They said that those are great aspects to show to the world. And we do agree that that is great. But the problem is that we actually don't get that from the sports community. We think we actually get things like we told you clearly at first, and they did not address how people from the Crusaders versus the Blues have their own just divisionary ideas, and that they argue and fight with each other because of this. Or we have, on the other hand, this whole actively exclusionary regime where people who are not interested in sport don't feel welcomed or in New Zealand, or don't even feel appreciated for being interested in art or interested in music, or for example. But finally, under that point, we think that every other country has sport as their national identity. So when a country like New Zealand actually changes that and it's not prominent, and they have something like their women's rights movement or STEMs, what we actually do is we make countries think, wow, they are different, they are unique, we want to work with them and collaborate with New Zealand because they're not like everyone else. They actually value their moral concepts more than entertainment. They value Māori history and culture more than just the idea of sports and playing games. We want to stand by that. We want to stand by actual cultural ideas in the plane, because that is important and that's what gets heard, a direct message. But finally, under that point, but now onto that point of community. So they gave us 3 points for this. So first they talked about how it helps people who are poor be raised and get to play in sport because through scholarships and stuff. First response to that is we don't think that's actually exclusive to sport. We think that, for example, STEM can give help to people who are poor and raise them up out of poverty. But secondly, we think that what actually happens is the people who get these scholarships are treated badly because people are like, oh, they only got the scholarship because they were Māori. They're not actually talented in that sport. They don't need to earn it. So that's off. But secondly, again, we also think that it's only white men shown at the top. And even though we think there are some Pacifica people and Māori people on the team, it's still not properly representative of their culture. Nobody understands, for example, with the haka, nobody nobody understands the importance behind it. So would you rather multiculture shown in the raw form rather than aspects nobody understands, for example, with the haka? Secondly, under this point of community, we think that they only create community for small groups of like males and boys club. They exclude people like women. They exclude people who are not interested in sport, because the sad reality is that nobody knows the name of the nobody knows anything, any of the members from the female rugby team in New Zealand or anything else. But secondly, we think that we also get this whole aspect of that people are discouraged from celebrating their own achievements and being interested in art, for example, because of this whole action. So now let's look into my substantive point about the harms of ignoring other industries. So at this point, I'm going to tell you two things. First, why it is important to celebrate all industries, and secondly, how a sporting national identity prevents that. Currently, what do we actually see? We think a prominence of sport means that things like art and the music and all these and science are neglected from our national identity, or multiculture in particular. What this means is that people are discouraged from collective action. And by this, what we mean is people like groups in the climate change march. People don't want to join in and fight for change for their country because they feel like they're neglected by their own country and their own needs. So they're not going to fight together and collectively. They feel disenfranchised. They don't feel united. So they're not going to stand and support their country. But secondly, because of this, it actually affects celebrating other industries and people wanting to become sportsmen. So why is it important to celebrate all industries? We think that if we don't, like I told you with sport, it means others are neglected. People are actually discouraged from their own professions and achievement. They're discouraged from becoming a writer or an actor because they don't get the recognition they deserve. Sport only gets recognition and not them. So young people only grow up aiming to be a rugby player rather than wanting to be a musician or an artist. And we think that it's important to have more than that. But secondly, we think that even rugby at best, it's only, even if we have rugby at its best and people join that, it's only a select minority of people who get entertainment. If we encourage something like academics and innovation in our national identity, we get more of it. And what that means is that we can help people to achieve with new innovation and technology, and we get to be shown for quite an innovatory nation, and people want to work in us that aspect. So overall, what happens from this is that we get a more active nation on our side. We get collectively together. We all have the same goal because everyone feels represented on our side. But we also think we get more inclusion. We recognize other people. So overall today, what we stand by is having a world and a national identity that represents everyone, that everyone feels welcomed in, and that they can proudly call themselves Kiwis. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to ask, are we good to go? Cool, I'd now like to invite the second speaker of the negative team, Merle, to come and continue her team's case.
Sorry, just sorting out the table, had to move. Okay. The shared appreciation we hold as a country for sports has played a crucial part in shaping our national identity, helping shape New Zealand, a fairly new country, into the progressive and successful nation it is today. Side neg doesn't see how else this could have been achieved. Today I'll be introducing the substantive how sports contributes to New Zealand communities. However, before I do this, I'd like to respond to the main arguments. So the main argument we're really seeing is around sports attitudes. They've largely responded to our ideas about how important it is that we have sports because it's built up this attitude of resilience and grit by then saying that we don't get that because a lot of people argue and fight. What we see is that actually a lot of people are invested in sports because it makes up a a large part of the national identity. So it creates quite an emotive experience of them. People invest in it. It creates purpose and drive and ambition. And that you can see this in this. But also that is largely a reflection of the individual themselves and not a reflection of sports. We feel like this is important to note. It also makes a lack of interest in other areas. So they've said that other areas such as STEM and arts aren't prioritized enough. So what we actually think with this is that we have a society that values attitude over tangible academic success, which causes more harm than good. Because STEM, for instance, is a system which isn't catered to raising up an individual the same way sports is. Sports is about improvement and community support and creating a better version of yourself. It is about supporting each other and working as a team, while academia creates destructive perfectionist ideals because of the desire to achieve perfect grades, and often leaves people in lower decile areas or people who don't have access to equal opportunity out of the system completely, which can lose the sense of belonging that sports is able to create in any aspect. Zealand. Moving on sports attitude, we also have largely, they said that on the point of like scholarships, they're saying scholarships also happen with STEM. But the issue that we currently have is that STEM teaching isn't available to everyone in New Zealand to such a degree that scholarships are that widely available. A lot of communities are far better able to support sports, and therefore scholarship opportunities are far more available. Therefore, it's far more important that we keep upholding sports, that sports have actually been incredibly important in creating opportunities for people. They also said that, moving on to the idea about inclusion. So their responses to inclusion have been that, oh, we don't actually prioritize feminism and Māori history enough. So what we think is that this is contingent on showing that sports actively stifles those. What we feel is that feminism and Māori history and a lot of other things which they really want to support, they haven't shown how that would get better if sports weren't prominent, but they've also neglected to notice that these are topics which have many different perspectives and many different ideas that are tossed around, and the only way we're going to be able to approach them is if we have a unified attitude. Sports is simple, but enough people relate to it, enough people enjoy it that they can get this unified perspective, this unified sense of community. It's an equal playing ground. While issues around women's rights and stuff, you get people on all sides of the field, and that means that we're never going to be able to build an identity fully forged around social issues. And even then, New Zealand is incredibly progressive. We are doing incredibly well with women's rights. We're getting better and better at showing how important Māori history is. Yes, we do understand the significance of the haka. That is why everyone cheers and understands that they need to respect it when it comes up in a rugby match. And we are doing more and more every day to try and understand the importance of that. They're also saying that like changing our identity will make us better on an international level. Actually, as it stands with our current identity, we're doing great. Sports does make us popular. See rugby, we are well regarded overseas for our All Blacks. Additionally, we are important. COVID, for instance, the COVID situation, how well we've handled it, has made us an incredibly important player on an international scale and shows how well we work together as a country with that unified perspective, which really is supported by sports. So with all of that in mind, I'd also like to move on to my first point, and my only point at that. So how sports contributes to New Zealand communities. In this point, I will be stepping through what sports looks like in a community, the effect this has on people, and how this benefits them. So what does sport look like in a community exactly? New Zealand's cultural ties with sports means you see this reflected on any level in New Zealand, not only on like a larger scale in society or to an individual level, but it's heavily reflected in communities where unified love and ties to identity physically manifest. So we see this with sports clubs, local sports teams, sports, rugby games at the pub, yes.
Not everyone likes sports, then so logically any community based off sports is also built off exclusivity.
Okay, it is not entirely based off exclusivity because the attitude that sports perpetuates is one that has grown to be a greater part of our national identity and has gone towards everyone's ideas. And not everyone likes STEM or art at that. You're actually trying to push away a far more inclusive field from people's grass, as we explain, a lot of people don't have access to STEM and arts. Moving on. So we see like this group love and cultural ties to sports connect us. It's mutual interest and attitude to shared mutual interest and attitude to self-improve or see others self-improve. And it is then shared and used as an opportunity to connect. This relatability creates a sense of belonging, and it's what builds these communities in the first place. So why are communities important anyways? Expanding on what Mia said, communities create a sense of belonging. It creates a better and happier view of self for many people. Sports takes these benefits a step further, and it really has allowed communities to thrive in New Zealand. What has sports done to communities? It's allowed a supportive network on a local level that values the can-do attitude that so much of New Zealand is successfully built on and sustains. It also has encouraged a purpose to people within these communities that keeps them happy and obligated to help their community back, which altogether creates them engaged with society. Why is that societal engagement important? So societal engagement is important because it betters people. It keeps them connected and grounded and in touch with others. Without connections to others, there is a potential for loss of purpose and doing things that an individual normally wouldn't do. What does this look like? It can look like poor mental health and the very real harms that can cause to someone. It can look like delinquent behavior as a way of trying to find self. You can see this as youth who don't have a sense of belonging entering gang culture in an attempt to find self, to find a sense of identity, and then proceeding to go through and do things that they normally wouldn't do. If anything, accepting to regret sports as a part of our national identity really harms these communities and makes it more likely that we don't actually have any communities that we can fall back onto, because there is nothing as simple and easily relatable as sports available to New Zealanders. And we have relied upon it for years so much because it is such a backbone of our community. So with all of this in mind, we do not regret sports being a prominent part of our national identity because it has kept New Zealand unified and it has promoted a healthy attitude for all of us. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you very much for that speech. We'd now like to invite the third speaker of the affirmative team to come and conclude the substantive proportion of her team's case. That's Isabel.
You just need to come off mute, please.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay. In today's debate, the negating team have fundamentally failed to understand that sport does not represent everyone. Right? We think that that is the most important part of a national identity, that it encompasses everyone's values, that it promotes unity, and that it allows us to really band together as a nation. Sport does not do that at the point in time where everyone knows the All Blacks. Everyone can probably name 5 or 6 All Blacks, but the majority of the country doesn't know when the women's rugby team play. They don't know what the women's rugby team's name is, right? We have so much exclusionary behavior in sport. It does not represent everybody, and it cannot be our national identity. We need our values to be at the forefront of them, and that does not come with sport. 3 points of clash for you today. Firstly, how does sport exclude and divide our country? Secondly, how do we actually tangibly improve the lives of minorities under our side of the house beyond just, oh, they'll be inspired? And then thirdly, why is it actually harmful to only prop up sport? So on this first point, how does sport exclude and divide our country? And we think this is pretty much a debate-winning point, right? Because the key purpose of national identity is to unite everyone. We regret that sport has failed to do that.
So the negating team live in this utopian society where everybody is like inspired by sport and they can like rise up out of poverty through that inspiration. We actually think that like the culture of sport is not that everyone like bands together and sees like some person succeeding and is like, wow, I can be, you know, like, wow, I can just like do that exact same thing. We think the culture of sport is like dad going down to the pub at 7 p.m. on a Saturday night and watching the game. We think it's things like your 12-year-old little sister feeling like she cannot come downstairs and watch the World Cup rugby game because the room is full of men drinking beer, right? That is the sport culture that we see in New Zealand today. We think the notion that people unite to watch rugby is just like fundamentally untrue, right? We think that the people who unite, right? So we're willing to accept that there are some people who unite behind rugby, but the kinds of people who these are like primarily men in like their middle-aged life, like their lives, people who are quite privileged, people who can go down to the pub. And we think that, yeah, sure, all of those people unite, all of those people have like a really awesome community. That's great. The issue is that everybody else is left out. Women are left out. People who aren't like manly men are left out. And like, it's just like really fundamentally harmful to all of these people for this group to be so close and so tightly knit around rugby, as the negating team wanted to tell us, when all of these people continue to be excluded, right? We think that that has been completely ignored by the negating team today, and that's what will lose them this debate. At the end of the day, things like getting grit and resilience and those sorts of cultures in our society are not exclusive to sport, and that like don't apply to everyone, right? When we access those cultures through sport, what we actually see is that only like men learn to be resilient, only like men who like are really sporty like learn that they need to have grit, as opposed to actually everyone understanding that this can be a national identity. It does not represent us, and it cannot stand as our national identity. It divides people, and it bolsters that division. So at the end of the day, sport continues to exclude our country and continues to divide it. Yes.
Hi, so how do STEM and arts, subjects not available to everyone, promote inclusivity when they're so exclusive?
Right, so I think part of the reason that like things like STEM and arts aren't actually like available to everyone is because so much funding and so much money goes into sports. I'm going to deal with that in my third point of clash, but actually we think that the key problem that the negating team just pointed out is a problem that actually they have to stand for and we do not. So yeah, moving on to my second point then. How do we on the affirmative team actually tangibly improve the lives of minorities? Because it's all good and well for the negating team to tell you that someone is going to watch like Ari Savia as like a non-white rugby player play rugby and be like, wow, now I can do everything. We're here to tell you that the more important way to actually help these people is to use government funds to like give children lunches in schools. It's to use funds to give people like to promote like all of this behavior, to promote Māori values, to promote feminism, to promote STEM subjects. It is, we improve the lives of minorities at the point in time where we stop telling people you can just be inspired by these random sports people, and where we actually take action. We think that that happens when the national identity of New Zealand is not based on a sport, but when it is based on the progress that we are making in our culture, the progress that we are making with regards to women, and the progress that we are making with regards to other minority groups. We think that when that is forefronted as our national identity, those are the areas that the government turns to invest in. Those are the areas that actually get genuine, tangible change. That doesn't happen when you just tell someone that there's a sports player who's doing something, so you can do it too. Right, why then are these like minority lives actively excluded from rugby? We think that like even if, or we think that first of all, like any access to like scholarships, any people participating who like aren't white tend to be quite tokenistic, right? They tend to just be like, right, everyone can band behind this person, everyone can follow them. And we don't think that ultimately that's like the best way to bring about change. But secondly, we think that even if there is like Māori presence in sport, we think that like we can't claim to understand like all of Māori culture, because I genuinely don't think anyone in this debate could probably translate the words of Kamate and tell you what that means. We don't think that Māori values are actually genuinely like propped up when we have sport as our national identity. We think that that only happens when we actually genuinely center our national identity around making tangible change. If New Zealand as a nation is so progressive, as the negating team wanted to tell you, when it comes to making that change, when it comes to bringing about like actual rights for women and voting rights and all that sort of thing, we should forefront that. That should be our national identity, and that will help us to create more change, help us to create more progression, whereas under their side they're happy to just sit back and like kick a ball around. At the end of that point, we tangibly improve the lives of minorities. The other side just tells them that like they have like a place they can go to, you can get there by yourself. So finally, why is it harmful to only prop up sport? And this is also sort of in response to the POI that we got at the earlier in the speech. Now, this is important because the aim of New Zealand is to like have a prosperous society. It's to have a nation that's progressive, that allows people to live and thrive. And we think that that cannot happen when the like central goal of our country is to play sport well. Because we think that like young people, when they see that, are first of all discouraged from wanting to be like artists and actors and that sort of thing. They are only given one career path that they think that they should like follow if they want to have the glory and like be a true New Zealander. They only have that one career path, and that just like continues to propagate this idea that there is like the superiority complex when it comes to rugby, and that like there is no other way to gain that like success. We think that the notion of resilience and grit being exclusive to rugby is completely wrong, right? The majority of like scientists had to go through a lot of hardship before they could like discover things like vaccines. And we think that it's actually really important to tell those stories as well as rugby stories, because like at the end of the day, rugby is important, right? But when we succeed in rugby, we win a World Cup. When we succeed in science, we get a coronavirus vaccine. And we think that's ultimately so much more important. At the end of the day, we think that it is really harmful to only prop up sport. We think we should prop up like general success within New Zealand. That includes academic success, that does include sport, and it also includes like art and culture, but that more importantly, our national identity should not be centered around any one of those. It should not like just pluck out one of those. It should promote things that we do that are positive with regards to multiculture, with regards to feminism, and with regards to minorities. At the end of this debate, we have won because we have told you that New Zealand is worse off as a country when our national identity is centered around sport rather than the things that we are actually doing to tangibly change people's lives. We've told you that we are the only team that improves the lives of minorities. We are the only team that allows people to explore more than one career opportunity. And we are the only team to unite New Zealand.
Awesome, thank you very much for that speech. Finally, I'd like to ask the third negative speaker to come and conclude their team's case.
Not only does side F have no respect for simple happiness and entertainment that sports brings, they also are consistently erasing minority groups of people that value sport in the very same breath that they claim sport is inherently sexist and racist. We stand for what sport offers our society, and we are very, very proud to propose. I'll be asking two questions today. Firstly, does sport exacerbate social divides? And secondly, is sport effective at uniting New Zealand? So a lot of the space in this debate today has been taken up by the idea that sport is inherently divisive. So the affirmative team has suggested that sport basically only celebrates a small group of people, and they suggested that sport is divisive in three ways. Firstly, they suggested that sport is inherently classist and that only certain people can engage in it. For example, they provided the example of rugby. However, we basically argue that any other area in which you're expecting people to engage in a community level is exclusionary in similar ways. Like, it's ridiculous to claim that just because people can't meet at the same time on a day means that the act of the sport in itself is divisive and exclusionary. What sport actually exemplifies is that through hard work, you basically can be celebrated, and that's valued at all levels of New Zealand society. For example, they suggested that STEM was something that could be equally as uniting, but what you don't need for sport is an expensive tutor or a really, really good private school. What you need for sport is the grit and we say that is reflected in New Zealand values that all New Zealanders feel proud of, that stem from our origins, whether that origins as Pākehā pioneers or origins as Māori people in New Zealand. Yeah, I'll take your PY.
How do you propose that we include people under your side who aren't interested in sports at all? How is that representative for our national identity?
Okay, so that perfectly integrates into my second question, in which I'll also be talking about why the affirmative side of the house does absolutely no better, in fact, does worse. So secondly, the second way in which they claim sport was divisive was they claim that it's sexist. So it's true that currently there is a huge disparity between, for example, a male and female rugby team. However, this is a gap that is currently closing. For example, in the past 2 years, sports coverage, television coverage of our female sevens team, for example, has increased from none at all to like very regular coverage. And we think that any kind of progress is something that needs to be recognized. So taking them at their best. If people are used to seeing sport as the epitome of sexism, which they seem to think that it is, it's actually incredibly powerful for them to see this change happen as society changes. Because of the existing contrast, because of like the previous perceived male dominance of sport, it encourages all New Zealanders that value sport, many of which potentially will not be the most progressive people, to look at their own society with fresh eyes. That, as I said, that analysis is taking the affirmative team at their best. However, realistically, sexism actually exists in absolutely every aspect of our society. Sexist ideas have been projected on sport like every single little part of daily life. We'd argue that practicing law in itself is not sexist, but some actions that were carried out at Russell McVeigh perhaps were sexist. As society is moving forward, so is sport. And because sport is potentially, or in the past, has not been viewed as the most gender balanced activity, as it does progress, there's a compounding effect that I just explained that encourages people to look at their society with fresh eyes and encourages people to look at how they can do better. So thirdly, how is sport divisive in terms of race? So the affirmative team has consistently stated that sport in New Zealand places white men in a spotlight. And this is just absolutely blatantly untrue. Sport is incredibly important and is actually a connecting factor for many groups of minorities to the New Zealand public. For example, rugby is incredibly important in many Pacifica societies, and for example, cricket is incredibly important in many South Asian societies, and these common passions actually connect them to other New Zealanders. But what we think is really interesting is that it's actually the affirmative team that is being really harmful when they say that, you know, whenever Māori people are celebrated in sports, it's because of their race, and it's actually not because of their inherent ability. And we think that that sport actually does provide an opportunity for those for whom it is like culturally important, or for those that have a passion for sport, to be able to segue into this area. And we think that it is inherently far less racist than most other areas. Indeed. And on that point, this was kind of a segue aspect. So they basically suggested that we were suggesting that there's only one career path because people only see themselves represented in one area. Now that is something that absolutely needs to change. It's also something that's not entirely true. But yes, certain groups of people are more represented in sport than they are in other areas currently. That needs to change. That's not an issue to do with sport in itself. It is very, very good that certain minorities are represented in sport. So that point is not effective. Now, onto my second point of Flash, is sport effective at uniting New Zealand? So the bulk of their case was basically about the fact that sport is inherently divisive. And as I just proved to you, it's really, really not. So already, because their analysis that sport wasn't effective at uniting New Zealand was based on the fact that they said it was divisive, was contingent on that. And it is not. No, but so let's look at now at basically their suggestion for what they believe will do better. So I'll take a POI for what they believe is better. So they suggested that we teach everyone kind of things to improve the lives of minorities, etc., which is a really, really valuable goal to have. So they suggested, that we use funding that currently goes into sports to promote Māori values, feminist values. So basically they claim that this will improve lives for minorities and unite people. However, they did this with absolutely mechanisms behind them. They explained in no way how that actually works and how that happens. And yet, right earlier in their speeches, they said that representation in sport actually doesn't improve lives for minorities because doesn't improve lives for minorities because basically they stated that a lot of people have, for example, assumptions that when a good player of a certain like racial background is celebrated, it's only because they're of that certain racial background. So what do you think that the response will be when, I don't know, I actually don't know what you'll be showing people because you haven't really like said it in any explicit ways, maybe shoving like feminist pamphlets down people's throats. What do you think that that will have the effect? What effect do you think that will have on New Zealand society, particularly those that are not really open to those ideas? That is what is tokenistic, and that is what is divisive. The affirmative team, or the negating affirmative team today provides absolutely no tangible benefits. As we'd like to say, sport is already valued, and change and representation in sport is amplified basically tenfold because it's something that's already valued by New Zealand people. And when they say change in sport happening that reflects their society, it makes them look at their society with new eyes. And additionally to that, it's also lovely and happy, and entertainment is really, really awesome for people. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you very much for that speech. As is customary, we now reverse the speaking order for replies. So I'd like to invite the negative reply from Central North Island to conclude their team's case. Thank you.
Thank you. Side F stands for a world of inclusivity and yet asks to take away the platform that has allowed for an unprecedented level of unison for millions of New Zealanders from all different backgrounds. 3 points of clash in our debate today. Firstly, does sport perpetuate harmful attitudes? Secondly, representation. And thirdly, community improvement for national identity. Let's look at the harmful attitudes that Side F claims is perpetuated by sport. Note that the entire point of this case for Side F was contingent that sport is a divisive, racist, and classist like perpetuator. What do we tell you to this? We tell you that actually sport is one of the most important ways and one of the only ways in New Zealand that actually people from minorities backgrounds and low decile communities can see people of their background achieving unprecedented levels of success and praise by the whole of New Zealand. We don't really see this in many different ways. And also we'd note that like their examples that they gave of STEM and like arts themselves are incredibly exclusive and even more elitist and divisive than sport. Sport provides a really important level playing field for millions of people and young people in order to see themselves being able to thrive. And we think that providing this inspiration, providing people the opportunity to see themselves achieve this is incredibly important, not only to support national identity, but to construct it. Secondly, on representation. Now they told us that, look, we don't think sport's important. What we're going to do is we're going to give more attention to feminism and multiculture. First of all, they gave absolutely no mechanism or analysis how they would achieve this or what this would look like. They just sort of hoped that it would happen as soon as we take away sport. Now, we'd also know that actually, under the status quo right now, New Zealand is actually incredibly liberally progressive towards like feminist rights. Like, for example, Jacinda Ardern taking her baby to the UN, you know, that was really highly praised by New Zealand. We still get these like outlooks on feminism, even though sport is like such a significant part of our culture. We think it's really important that we stood by on our side of the house, that like feminism and multiculture isn't at the cost of sport. Instead, we've told you how multi-representation and things like the All Blacks and the display of the haka on the international community actually sends a really important message that we're proud to portray our multiculture and that this is something we're really, really proud of and want to include inside our national identity. When you take this away and you take away the opportunities for loads of people from minority backgrounds who actually sport is a really important and often one of the only outlets for them to achieve this, you're actually taking away from this whole aspect of multiculture and feminism that people would have been able to have provided in the first place. We think that having this, like, their elitist view is incredibly arrogant for them to think that, like, anyone can just join into these fields as easily as sport, whereas we've established how important sport is for providing people engagement. And this leads me on to my third point of clash on the community improvement. We told you at first, second and third how important sport is on uniting not only national identity, but also looking like on a regionally domestic level, how communities are improved and feel enlightened and strengthened when you get people like united by a common sports team, and how this actually mitigates the risk of things such as like delinquency, gang involvement and things like that, because you have people united by this. And also importantly, like especially those in rural communities, sport is a really important way for people to feel engaged within the sphere of New Zealand and their identity. Where SIDE-AF has massively underestimated the huge sphere of influence that sport has, and actually the detriment it would do in taking this away. Sport has constructed a huge pillar of how people view themselves, how people view New Zealand, and how New Zealand views itself in the international role. It portrays incredibly important things of resilience and inclusivity that we are so proud to support and oppose this moot today. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'd now like to invite the affirmative reply to make up the final speech at this debate today. Thank you.
Most chaotic thing.
New Zealand gave women the right to vote before any other country in the world. Is glorifying an industry that's just starting to fight sexism really representative of New Zealand as a whole and the values that we want to represent? This debate today fell into two main points of clash. Firstly, how does sport prop up national division? And secondly, how are minorities impacted by sport being so prominent in our national identity? I'd like to start to look at the first point of clash. The opposing team's world looked like massive unity around rugby and sports, and like this massive supportive community to do with sports. Well, in reality, what this really looks like, as we told you at first, at second, and at third, is that what this looks like is a boys' club of all white men going to the pub to watch rugby on a Friday night. This is not a massive culture of community and inclusivity. So this culture is not actually as the opposing team would have you believe. Actually, even if it was, this would still not be representative of the national identity. We actually directly asked the opposing team how they would include disinterested people, like people who are not interested in sports, how they would be represented in our national identity. They did not reply to this. We were left with no response. These people have been left out of our identity as a whole. We also brought up our examples of how this sport is actually not a unitary thing, right? Because of the culture of like Super Rugby and the 5 teams, and everyone's split into like this rivalry between the other teams. We've actually seen that this has not promoted unity culturally as much as like any other thing, such as Māori values would. So for this reason, at the end of this point, we know that sport does not prop up national division, which we said at the start of this debate was the criteria that something had to fit before it became our national identity. Okay, on to the second point of clash, how minorities are impacted. So we believe on our side of the house that what's really important, which we told you right from first, is things like celebrating Māori values. The opposing team came out and said, well, we have Māori values in sport. We actually told you at second and at third that if we want to celebrate Māori values, a better way to do this would be making these a bigger part of the national identity, rather than incorporating them further into sports. We think that while we are not rejecting sport as a whole, we're just saying it should not be the national identity. We think that there are way more important things, such as these Māori values and these Māori culture. In terms of direct impact on minorities, we only get actual tangible positive change for minorities on our side of the house, as we've already told you, right? So rather than like being inspired when they like watch sports people, we told you, we at first brought out a mechanism that we want, like we think that when there's not going to be sports, there's going to be these resources and there's going to be this funding that is going to be able to go to things like money being given to kids who are going without lunches. We directly mechanize that. We think that we also told you at second that we thought that it was way more effective than the opposing team's comparative, which is All Blacks advocating for equity in schools we told you that we get the most direct impact on our side of the house. So we think that the direct way that we're going to improve minority lives is money, which we've told you right from first we will get when we take away this constant funding of a national identity that does not respect us as a whole. So at the end of this point, we see that the most positive change comes when we stop giving these resources to the massive rugby union corporation to play games at Eden Park, and we actually give it to people who need them to support Māori values is becoming more of our national identity in New Zealand. And so when the opposing team failed to meet that criteria for a national identity, they won today's debate. So at the end of that, we know that while everyone may be lovely and happy with their entertainment, their harms far outweigh any potential benefits of being able to go to the pub and watch rugby and watch a haka, as opposed to supporting Māori culture and arts and culture in New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you.